Hello, my name is Kevin McAleer, and I am the author of the new novel LA Kid, which has been published by Palm Art Press here in Berlin. It is now available in Europe. It is also available in North America. And with every book I write, I do it for the sake of the writing. I enjoy writing. I do it for my own enjoyment. But with this book was the thought that people around the world seem to think they know LA because it's been the pop culture hotspot of the world for the past 100 years or so. But the question is, what is it like to grow up there? And I grew up there. I'm a fourth generation Angeleno. The period of my youth was the 1960s and 70s. And when you have a book entitled LA Kid, the question is raised, well, what's the difference between an LA kid and a Berlin kid or a Paris kid, New York kid, Miami kid, whatever? Well, I can tell you that the great difference between growing up in Los Angeles, at least in the 60s and 70s, and perhaps it still holds today, is that we in Los Angeles, we believe neither in death nor in history. And I'll go to my chapter at Death's Door to perhaps illustrate that. And this is the protagonist, Steve McElhenney, and he's in his second year of college. He's at a junior college, two-year college. The only real intellectual advance I made at Setubak College was in realizing that I wanted to major in history. This was mainly due to having grown up in a city where everything new was by definition superior to that which was old and innately inferior. It had even seeped into the lingo, people using the word history to denigrate or dismiss something. For example, after a bad date with some girl, you would say, that chick's history. Or your hometown team won't make the playoffs. The Dodgers are history. So over time, my contrarian default position had become that of strongly preferring the older stuff, and this included days of yore. My Russian history course that spring may have also played a role. It was taught by an elderly gentleman who wore loud sport jackets and smoked an aromatic pipe as he recounted the sad lament of Russian history, from the Viking invasions to the Mongol hordes to Ivan the Terrible and other despotic czars, then on through Napoleon and Hitler and the bloody-minded Stalin. I was surprised how engaging a non-stop chronicle of other people's misery could be. I was also surprised by another good course offered at Setubak College that spring. The course was titled The Philosophy of Death. My choice of this course was also a reaction to my LA environment, where the cemeteries looked like golf courses and funeral directors called themselves life transition consultants. I'd never been confronted with the subject of death in a candid way, and it seemed high time. The class included field trips, and our Charon to the underworld was Professor Walsh. He started the course by chalking these words on the blackboard. There is but one truly serious philosophical question, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. Albert Camus. Camus wasn't interested in suicide as such, but why people don't commit suicide, how they give their lives meaning, while Walsh was interested in suicide as such. We worked our way through romantic suicide, the suicide of honor, mystical suicide for a transcendent cause, and then Walsh expiated on despair-induced suicide. This was something I hadn't yet considered, even in my continuing depressed state, but as Walsh spoke, I definitely pricked up my ears. "I was a GI in Europe during World War II," Walsh began. "Our column was on a forced march through the Vosges Mountains in eastern France. There had been heavy rains, the going treacherous, when a fellow named Pritchard lost his footing. He fell in the path of one of our Sherman tanks and it rolled right over his midsection. Some 40 tons, this thing. Suddenly you had a man with arms and legs but no middle. Pritchard was screaming, 'Kill me! Shoot me! Oh God, shoot me!' Completely conscious this whole time, mind you, and fully aware of his fate. We just stood around helplessly. There was nothing we could do except watch him die and hear his suffering. Before medics could arrive on the scene, our captain put his service revolver to Pritchard's head and shot him." Whew! Our class breathed a sigh of relief. "And it was wrong," said Walsh. "Do you kill a man just because he asks you to? Stoicism and existentialism hold elective suicide to be the supremely free act, but it is only when done with rational forethought that suicide can be viewed as something more than an abject surrender. When Pritchard begged to be killed, it wasn't the voice of human reason, but a cry of beastly anguish." And as Walsh continued in this vein, I thought that I was with Pritchard and the captain on this one. Who wouldn't be? I hoped that Walsh was just being provocative. Our first field trip was to a neighboring university and its pathology lab. The dissecting facility reeked of temperature-cooled meat like the day after Thanksgiving when you open the refrigerator and get hit by the smell of turkey leftovers. Even the corpses laid out on the dissecting tables had the appearance of dark meat plus gristly portions. After our tour, the friendly guide handed us a form to fill out in case we wanted to be carved up when we died. I passed. I thought that moldering in the earth might make a more dignified exit, but that was before we visited the funeral parlor. The funeral parlor was part of a big Southern California mortuary chain. They took us around and showed us the porcelain bed where the embalming process took place. They showed us the cosmetics they used and described the sounds and movements that cadavers make. They ushered us into the coffin showroom with various models, including one that allowed the putative corpse to pull a wire and jingle a bell situated above ground, a just-in-case measure. Then they led us to the chapel where we could view their finished handiwork. An old woman had been doctored up to resemble a less than lifelike wax figure. As we left, they offered us a 35% discount on an oak coffin with brass handles, the discount including your own reserved plot. But at this point, I was thinking cremation, especially after our visit to the county morgue. The closest I'd ever gotten to a morgue had been Edgar Allan Poe's Murders in the Rue Morgue, which had nothing to do with morgues, and in truth, I would have had a tricky time explaining the exact difference between a morgue and a mortgage, though I did understand that they were both lousy long-term arrangements. In the receiving hall of the morgue, led by our guide, Al, our shoes squelched on the polished floor, then we turned left and entered a vast room with recumbent forms covered in sheets that reached to their ankles. Al fingered one of the toe tags and said, "This customer heard the call to glory at Melrose and La Brea, cracked up his Suzuki doing 80 through the intersection and wearing just a helmet, cutoffs, and sneakers, and almost no skin when he stopped skidding. Death from shock as induced by massive blood loss. So much for a mandatory helmet law." We walked to another big room. The walls had windows that gave you a view of bodies the morgue hadn't yet identified, but maybe the public could. Behind one window, a young woman lay supine with eyes shut and arms curled in front of her face. She was good-looking, except for the horrendous gash diagonally across her nose. The bone and cartilage showed white through gobs of clotted blood. This was the principal wound, but there were other injuries to her face, as well as her forearms and the back of her hands. Axe murder victim, said Al. Those lacerations on her hands and arms are what we call defensive cuts in trying to ward off the blows. Professor Walsh asked, "Did she die instantly, or was it a prolonged death agony?" Al said, "She died at the site." Walsh said, "I just wonder if she had any sense of her impending demise." "I imagine so," said Al, "though the woman to ask is in no condition." We moved to the cold storage locker. Al yanked out a long drawer of stainless steel, and we beheld a gelatinous mass swarming with green, gray, orange, and yellow fuzz. Al explained that this nightmare was a woman they had fished out of Echo Park Lake. It was a forensic case awaiting identification and likely another murder victim. Walsh said, "Note the advanced state of decay, the physical body's reversion to a reduced state of nature. Algae, fungus, mold, we decompose into plant life. When I see such things, I often wish I had studied botany. Then you get to the bottom of things." "Well," said Al, "they found her at the bottom of the lake."